Jesus cleanses the temple. From the Golden Treasury of Bible Stories by Spalding Books. This is taken from John 2, verses 13 through 25. Jesus cleanses the temple. Jesus did not stay long in Capernaum or in Galilee, for the time of the Passover soon came. And with his disciples he went up to Jerusalem. A great part of the temple service was the offering of animals as sacrifices. All of these sacrificial animals were meant by God to represent the coming Messiah, who should die for the sins of the world. But there were very few, if any, of the worshippers who understood this. Even the priests did not, and so they could not teach the people. They did tell them that their sins could not be forgiven unless they made the sacrifices. And so the poor people dumbly sacrificed animals, supposingly that somehow the blood of the bulls and the goats would pay for their sins. Most of the pilgrims could not bring their own animals for sacrifice because they came from such distances, so they had to buy them after they reached Jerusalem. Some men who were dealers in animals saw a great chance here to make money. They went to the priests and bargained with them to lease a part of the lower temple court for a market, and paid them well for it. Then they brought in the doves and the lambs and the goats and the bullocks which were used in sacrifice, and they sold them for high prices to the pilgrims, and they made a great deal of money that way. Then, besides, the pilgrims usually paid their tithes and offerings in money, but the priests could not take the money out of the various countries from which the pilgrims came, so they would only accept a special kind called the temple money. So there were other merchants who were called money changers, because they would take the foreign money and give it to the pilgrims' temple money for it. In doing this, they paid out far less than the worth of the money they took in, and so they too got rich. With all the buying and selling and bargaining, and the lowing of cattle, and the bleating of sheep and goats, and the trampling of feet, and the loud voices of the buyers and sellers, there was a great confusion in the temple courts. This was not what the house of God was meant to be. Some of the good men of the Jews were sorry for this state of things, but they could not seem to change it because chief priests who had charge of the temple wanted it so. They, as well as the merchants, made a great deal of money by it. When Jesus came into the temple court and saw this evil state of things, his pity and anger rose up. He gathered together some small cords that had been tied around bundles brought in, and then thrown away. He walked through the crowds, making the cords into a whip, until he came to the steps that went into the upper court. He went up these steps till he was above the crowd, and there he stood for a moment, silently looking over the scene. Quickly there ran a chill and a hush through the babbling crowd. All eyes were drawn to the figure Jesus standing above them. His eyes seemed to burn into the souls of the priests and the merchants and the money changers and all the people. In the silence his voice rang out, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a market." He walked down the steps, raising his whips and cords. The money changers and the merchants fell back and then turned and ran. The cattle and the other beasts broke loose and rushed away with them. And Jesus pressed on. He did not strike anyone with his little whip of cords. They did not wait for that. But he overthrew the tables of the money changers, and he emptied the stalls of the merchants of animals. Out of the temple streamed the unholy crowd. Even the disciples were awed. They had never before seen their master look like the thunder of God. No wonder the priests were scared and the merchants frightened out of their wits. So will the eyes of the Lord look upon the wicked ones in the last judgment day. But soon some of the priests and rulers gathered courage to come back, and that they were afraid of him too. Perhaps, they thought, he may be one of the prophets raised from the dead, or he may be a new prophet sent to make the temple service pure. So they came to him and said, "What sign do you show us that you are given authority to act this way?" That was absurd, because in driving them all out, he had given the greatest sign of his authority. As the prophet Malachi had said of him, "The Lord whom ye seek shall suddenly come into his temple." There stood before them the Holy One, the Messiah, whose coming to the temple made true the words of the prophet Haggai. To those who were mourning, because the temple of Zerubbabel seemed to much poorer than the temple of Solomon, he said, "The glory of this latter house shall be greater than that of the former, said the Lord of hosts." There was now in this temple, in the most holy place, no ark, and no glory of God resting upon it, But there was, standing in the court in the midst of the priests who questioned him, the very one who had commanded the making of the tabernacle and the building of the temple, and who in glory had filled each of them with his presence. He stood there, the glory of his life clothed within the temple of a human body, as the glory of God had once been enclosed in the walls of Solomon's temple. His glory had flashed forth for a moment, and they had fled in terror from it. But now it was veiled again. A sign? He would give them a sign. Pointing to himself, he said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." He meant the temple of his body, which they would yet destroy, but in 3 days he would raise from the tomb. They did not understand. They said scornfully, "This temple was 46 years in building, and you raised it up in 3 days?" Yet the words of Jesus troubled them. There seemed to be in them a hidden meaning, and they could not face him any longer. So they turned away and left him. They turned their backs upon their only hope, their anointed one, the Messiah, the Christ. Said John, he came unto his own, and his own received him not. O haughty priests with scornful glance, who spurn the light divine, how shall the temple radiance upon your dark mind shine? Here standing in your midst is he whose presence blessed this place. Your eyes are blind, you cannot see the glory of his face. O lift the veil and let the light, Shekinah's radiant flame, burst through the barriers of your night, ablaze the holy name.